Ever have that feeling where even the things you trust most might be holding secrets? Maybe it's when a longtime companion starts acting in ways you just can't understand. Well, that's exactly how my story began. In the bitter cold of northern Montana, where temperatures plummeted to a bone-chilling 20 below zero Fahrenheit, an unfathomable mystery unfolded between me and my loyal German shepherd, Max. But the real story? It blossomed in that icy air into something completely unexpected. You definitely won't want to miss this. The relentless cold of northern Montana in winter would drape the land in a stark white sheet, frosting the branches of the trees with icy crystals and leaving a sharp bite in the air that stung with every breath. It was a place renowned for its beauty as much as its danger. For years, I'd served as a forest ranger in this unforgiving terrain. And for the past 6, Max, my German shepherd, had been my most steadfast companion during those solitary days. His warm breath, the security I felt with him on our snowy treks, and the unconditional love in his intelligent amber eyes had transformed this place from just an assignment into a true home. Then one December, during one of the season's infamous cold spells, everything began to shift. Max, who usually greeted me at the door after my shifts with an enthusiastic rush, started acting completely out of character. For 3 straight days, he'd stayed glued to his doghouse, as if bound by an invisible leash. He wouldn't even come inside during the worst of the blizzard, his fur dusted with frost as he stood guard over his little wooden shelter. At first, I figured it was just a passing thing. Maybe he was feeling under the weather or something was bothering him. But with each passing day, my worry grew. The spark of his usual energy had vanished, replaced by a restless vigilance. Even when I left his food outside, he'd approach it cautiously, sniff once or twice, and then retreat, his gaze never leaving his doghouse. By the morning of the 4th day, I couldn't take it anymore. The air was still brutally cold, and I knew Max had spent the entire night outside. I bundled up in my thickest layers, pulling on my gloves and hat tight. A knot of unease had formed in my stomach, and I knew I had to find out what was going on. Grabbing a flashlight, I trudged through the snow-covered yard towards Max's doghouse. As I got closer, I noticed Max tense up. Normally, he'd be wagging his tail and trotting over to greet me. But now, he positioned himself like a barrier between me and the doghouse, letting out a low growl that stopped me in my tracks. Seeing this loyal friend of 7 years growl at me for the very first time sent a jolt of shock through me. "Max, what's wrong, boy?" I asked, bewildered, but he remained firm, unmoving. His eyes, reflecting in the beam of my flashlight, held an unreadable message: "Stay away." A mix of disappointment and deep curiosity washed over me as I backed away. Throughout the day, I watched him from the window. Max paced restlessly around his doghouse, occasionally sniffing at it before retreating, as if guarding something unseen. Even as darkness fell, he didn't come inside. He curled into a tight ball in the snow, his eyes still fixed on the doghouse, keeping watch. When I woke up the next morning, Max was still outside. A thin layer of fresh snow covered his fur, and he looked utterly exhausted. That was it. Something was seriously wrong, and I couldn't wait any longer. Arming myself with an old broom handle and a few pieces of thawed venison from last hunting season, I headed back towards the doghouse. This time, when Max greeted me with the same warning growl, I was prepared. I tossed the meat far to the left of the doghouse. Max hesitated, clearly torn between his duty to guard the structure and the tempting offering. It was then that I caught a flicker of movement at the entrance of the doghouse. A small, tawny shadow flickered partially into view before quickly retreating back inside. My heart pounded in my chest. Bear? No, too small. Coyote, maybe? When Max finally yielded to temptation and moved towards the meat, I seized my opportunity. In 3 long strides, I reached the doghouse and cautiously peered inside, bracing myself for an attack. But what I saw made me recoil in utter shock. Gazing back at me from the shadowy depths were a pair of brilliant amber eyes. Not Max's friendly gaze, but the fierce, untamed stare of a bobcat. The wild feline was crouched defensively in the back corner of the doghouse, its ears flattened, lips slightly drawn back in a silent snarl as I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over my own feet. A bobcat had taken over Max's shelter. This explained my dog's strange behavior. But the questions that followed were even more perplexing. Why would Max allow a predator to occupy his territory? And more importantly, why would he protect this wild intruder from me? Over the next couple of days, a bizarre standoff ensued. The bobcat refused to abandon the doghouse, and Max remained steadfast in his vigil. I tried several tactics to safely evict the wild animal. I set up an alternative shelter nearby, played recordings of predator sounds, and even called my old friend and colleague Tom Hardison from the Park Service for advice. Tom chuckled when I recounted the situation over the crackling phone line. "Sounds like you got yourself a stubborn one," he said. "Female, I'm guessing. This time of year. If she's not budging, there might be kittens involved." The possibility hadn't even crossed my mind. Bobcat kittens in December? It was unusual, but not unheard of. Late litters sometimes happened, though the winter survival rate was tragically low. With this new theory in mind, I adopted a more cautious approach. If there were indeed kittens, separating them from their mother or forcing them into the deadly cold would be a death sentence. On the fourth morning of this strange standoff, I woke before dawn and watched from the cabin window as the bobcat slipped out of the doghouse and disappeared into the woods, presumably to hunt. Max, exhausted from his constant guard duty, had finally succumbed to sleep, curled up in the snow about 15 feet from the doghouse. This was my chance. Bundled up against the frigid air, I moved quietly through the pre-dawn darkness, careful not to wake Max. The temperature had plummeted to 20 below zero Fahrenheit overnight, and my concern for potential bobcat kittens outweighed my caution. Kneeling in the snow outside the doghouse, I aimed my flashlight into the small entrance and peered inside. What I saw made my breath catch in my throat. Nestled in the back of the shelter, in a makeshift nest of dog blankets and shed fur, lay 4 tiny bobcat kittens. Their spotted coats were barely visible beneath the protective covering of Max's bedding. The kittens, no more than a few days old, were blind and helpless, huddled together for warmth in their mother's absence. "Oh my God," I whispered, understanding washing over me in a powerful wave. Max hadn't been driven from his shelter. He had surrendered it willingly. For 4 days and nights, in temperatures cold enough to freeze exposed skin in minutes, my German shepherd had stood guard over a wild mother and her vulnerable offspring, sacrificing his own comfort and safety for theirs. After what seemed like minutes, but was probably only seconds, Sierra rose and retreated to the tree lean before disappearing into the gathering darkness. She paused for one final glance back at the cabin, at Max, at the shelter that had saved her family. Then she was gone, melting into the forest like a ghost. "Well, I'll be damned," I murmured, blinking back unexpected moisture from my eyes. I wasn't a sentimental man by nature, but witnessing that silent exchange between two creatures from such different worlds had touched something deep within me. Throughout that spring and into the summer, I occasionally spotted Sierra in the distance during my patrols of park. Once, I even glimpsed 2 half-grown kittens trailing behind her along a remote ridgeline, though she never again approached the cabin directly. I sometimes found evidence of her presence. Tracks in the mud near the creek, or once, remarkably, a freshly killed rabbit left at the edge of the clearing, perhaps a gesture of reciprocity. Max always seemed to know when she had been nearby, raising his nose to the wind and standing at attention, surveying the trees with keen interest. The unexpected bond between them had changed something in Max. He became more attuned to the wilderness around us, more patient in his observations, as though Sierra had awakened some dormant, wild instinct within his domesticated heart. As for me, the winter's extraordinary events had shifted something in me as well. Having witnessed such selfless compassion from my canine companion, I found myself viewing the natural world with renewed humility and respect. The arbitrary boundaries between wild and tame, between natural enemies and unlikely allies, seemed less fixed than I had once believed. When visitors to the ranger station asked about the best wildlife viewing spots, I would share information about elk migrations and eagle nesting sites. But I kept the story of Max and Sierra to myself, a private reminder that in the harshest of circumstances, compassion could emerge from the most unexpected sources. On particularly cold nights, I would often find Max sitting at the window, gazing out at his doghouse and the stand of pines beyond. During these moments, I would place a hand on my dog's broad back, sharing the quiet vigilance, both of us watching and waiting. For what exactly, neither could say. Perhaps we were simply acknowledging the unlikely lesson we had learned together. That true strength lies not in dominance or territory, but in recognizing vulnerability and offering shelter against a storm, even to those we have been taught to fear. And if, on the coldest nights of following winter, Max occasionally abandoned his comfortable place by the wood stove to resume his post near the pine trees, I never questioned it. Some promises, I had come to understand, transcended species and seasons, connecting us to one another in ways that defied explanation but demanded respect. In the vast wilderness of northern Montana, where life and death played out with unforgiving regularity, a domestic dog had chosen compassion over comfort, protection over self-preservation. And in doing so, he had not only saved a family of wild creatures, he had taught his human companion the most profound lesson of all, that the capacity for kindness existed even in the unlikeliest of circumstances, waiting only for the opportunity to emerge. When the first snow of the next winter began to fall, I built a new shelter and placed it in the stand of pines. Max watched approvingly from the porch, his posture alert, ready as always to stand guard if needed. I understood now that some connections, once formed, never truly disappeared. They simply waited, patient and enduring, like the wilderness itself. If this incredible story resonated with you, if it touched your heart and you'd like to hear more tales like this, please take a moment to subscribe to my channel and give this video a thumbs up. I'd also love to hear your thoughts in the comments section below. Until the next story, stay connected to nature and the power of kindness. Movement behind me made me turn. Max was awake, watching me intently, no longer growling, but clearly concerned about my proximity to his charges. "You incredible animal," I said softly, my voice thick with emotion. "You've been protecting them all this time." As if understanding, Max approached cautiously, sniffing at my hand before looking toward the doghouse entrance. There was such intelligence in the dog's eyes, such purpose, that I felt humbled by the depth of compassion my companion was capable of. I retreated to the cabin, my mind racing. The situation was precarious. The mother bobcat would return soon, and I had no desire to be caught near her kittens. Yet, I couldn't bear the thought of Max spending another night in the deadly cold, especially now that I understood his incredible sacrifice. By mid-morning, I had formulated a plan. Working quickly in my workshop, I constructed a second shelter using plywood and insulation materials I had on hand. I positioned it about 20 yards from Max's doghouse, concealed behind a stand of young pine trees, where the mother bobcat would hopefully feel secure. Inside the new shelter, I placed heating pads powered by a long extension cord running from the cabin. I lined the floor with soft blankets and added a protective covering over the entrance to block the wind. It wasn't perfect, but it might be enough to convince the mother bobcat to relocate her family to safer quarters. The transfer would be the dangerous part. I couldn't risk moving the kittens myself. The mother might abandon them if they carried human scent. Instead, I would need to create a situation where she would move them on her own. When the bobcat returned from hunting around noon, I watched from a distance as she slipped back into the doghouse, giving Max a wide berth. The German shepherd, seemingly understanding some unspoken agreement between them, allowed her passage before resuming his guard position. My opportunity came after nightfall. With Max safely inside the cabin, fed and finally resting near the wood stove, I implemented my plan. Using a remote-controlled speaker I sometimes employed to deter problem bears, I placed it near Max's doghouse and retreated to watch from the cabin window. When I activated the speaker, playing the recorded sound of male bobcat, a potential threat to kittens, the reaction was immediate. The female emerged from the doghouse, kittens dangling one by one from her mouth. Exactly as I had hoped, with practiced efficiency, she transported her litter through the snow, instinctively heading for the concealed shelter I had prepared, perhaps drawn by the promising warmth it offered against the brutal cold. I watched, heart pounding, as she investigated the new structure cautiously before disappearing inside with her last kitten. Minutes passed, then an hour. She didn't emerge again, apparently accepting the new refuge. Only when I was certain the transfer was complete did I finally release the breath I'd been holding. My gamble had paid off. The next morning, Max reclaimed his doghouse, though not before inspecting it thoroughly. I cleaned it out, replacing the old bedding with fresh blankets, praising my dog continuously for his extraordinary behavior. "You're one of a kind, you know that?" I told Max, who seemed pleased to have his shelter back, but still cast occasional glances towards the stand of pines where the bobcat family had relocated. Over the following weeks, as January's grip tightened around the Montana wilderness, I observed a remarkable relationship unfold. The bobcat mother, whom I'd named Sierra, gradually became accustomed to my presence, watching warily from a distance as I left food near her shelter. Max, for his part, continued his self-appointed role as protector, regularly checking on the bobcat family during his daily patrols of the property. Sometimes, in the early mornings or late evenings, I would spot Max sitting near the pine trees, maintaining a respectful distance but clearly keeping watch. Occasionally, Sierra would emerge, acknowledging the dog's presence with a slow blink before disappearing back into the shelter with her growing kittens. By February, the kittens had become more adventurous, tumbling out of their shelter on sunny afternoons to play in the snow under their mother's vigilant eye. I documented their progress with my camera from the cabin porch, careful never to approach too closely. Tom Hardison from the Park Service visited twice, equally fascinated by the unusual arrangement. "I've been working with wildlife for 30 years, he told me during a second visit, "and I've never seen anything like this. That dog of yours has adopted a family of wild predators. It's unprecedented." He recognizes vulnerability, I replied, watching as Max patrolled the perimeter of the clearing, giving Sierra and her kitten space while keeping other potential threats at bay. I think he knew they wouldn't survive without shelter. Still, Tom said, shaking his head in amazement, most domestic dogs would see a bobcat as competition or a threat. The fact that he not only tolerated her presence but actively protected her and her kittens, it's extraordinary. As March arrived, bringing slightly warmer temperatures and the first tentative signs of spring, I began to prepare myself for the inevitable departure of the bobcat family. Sierra's kittens were growing rapidly, their spotted coats thickening, their movements becoming more coordinated and precise as they practiced hunting skills on fallen leaves and twigs. The separation, when it finally came, was both expected and surprisingly emotional. I woke one morning in late March to find Max sitting with a tense posture on the porch, his gaze fixed on the pine trees. The door to the bobcat shelter stood open. The interior was empty. Sierra had moved her family on, likely to establish a proper territory now that her kittens were strong enough to travel. Max seemed to understand, though he continued checking the empty shelter for several days, sometimes lying nearby as if hoping for their return. I found myself doing the same, scanning the tree line each morning, feeling an unexpected sense of loss. "They needed to go, buddy," I told Max, scratching behind his ears as we sat together on the porch steps. "They belong out there, living the way they're supposed to live." 3 days later, as dusk settled over the valley, I spotted movement at the edge of the clearing. Sierra emerged from the trees alone, her tawny coat almost invisible against the brown undergrowth of early spring. She paused, seeming to survey the cabin and surrounding area before focusing her attention on Max, who had risen to his feet, tail wagging slightly. For a long moment, the wild feline and domestic canine regarded each other across the distance, natural adversaries who had formed an improbable alliance. Then, Sierra did something that left me speechless. She approached Max slowly, stopping just a few feet away, and lowered herself to a sitting position. There was nothing submissive in her posture. Rather, she conveyed a dignified acknowledgement, one predator recognizing another. Max remained still, his usual exuberance tempered by what I could only describe as respect. No growls, no bristling fur, just quiet acceptance of Sierra's presence.